Advocates for Balance at Chautauqua is proud to present eminent attorney and fellow Chautauquan, Larry D. Thompson. Mr. Thompson has had an unusually distinguished career in three major areas of law, which is very unusual: private practice at the Atlanta law firm of King and Spalding, as Deputy Attorney General in the Bush administration, and as a corporate counsel for PepsiCo, among others. Quiet Counsel, which is his recently published memoir, encapsulates Mr. Thompson's legal insights and personal philosophies, offering thoughtful perspectives on improving the nation through the legal system. In a time of noisy debates, Thompson's work highlights the power of a measured, quiet approach to addressing key issues. He reminded me that he actually spoke on the main stage in 2004. Some of you may have been here for that. And he was representing the Republican Party at that time when he spoke there. He's also a member of the Board of Trustees here at Chautauqua Institution. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please welcome Larry D. Thompson.
Thank you, Paul. And I think I, too, am a sober attorney.
He's had a couple of cookies, so you can't tell.
I was only testing them to see if they were okay to eat. Again, thank you, Paul, and thank you for inviting me. It's really kind of challenging to speak in front of your close friends and neighbors, so I'll see how this goes tonight, because I've given a number of these book talks, but not really before my neighbors. I consider Paul a good friend, and I hope he considers me a friend. We share a love of jazz music, and we also share our desire to make certain that this place that we both greatly love, that we have a more diverse political and ideological speakers from time to time. I think we're doing better this year, but Paul and I have worked on that. You know, the big stage, the amphitheater, as Paul mentioned, you know, obviously that's the critical speaking platform for Chautauqua. But I think these, what I call small stage speeches, are very important, very important. Two of the best speeches I've heard here at Chautauqua were on the small stage. The first one, and I'll see if anyone that remembers this speech, hold your hand up, was one that was sponsored by the African American Heritage House a few years ago. It was by the Yale historian David Blight, and he talked about Frederick Douglass's wonderful 4th of July speech. Do any of you remember that speech? And I saw my wife's hand go up, and I'm going to just introduce her before Brenda, this is Brenda Thompson, my wife of 55 years. And the second speech, which I thought was a magnificent speech, was here last year at ABC by Amity Shales during the week where we discussed the presidency. And she spoke on Calvin Coolidge. And it was a penetrating and a great speech. How many of you were here for that speech? Terrific. So those are two of the best speeches I've heard. And sometimes, you know, those of us who come to Chautauqua, we think we need to read everything, we want to follow everything, and we really, sometimes you feel like you want to be Superman, and you want to know everything there is to know. And let me talk to you about Superman. I got a little story to tell you about Superman. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, and Muhammad Ali, you all remember Muhammad Ali, the former heavyweight champion of the world. He fought a bout in Atlanta. He fought Jerry Quarry, and he knocked him out at his appointed round. And so obviously he was feeling pretty good. And the heavyweight champion had a farm where he worked out in Pennsylvania. So he was in the big Atlanta airport, and he was really feeling good after he had knocked out Jerry Quarry at the appointed round. And the plane was taxiing down the runway, and Ali was holding forth, and a flight attendant came to him and said, "Sir, fasten your seatbelt." And he just ignored her, or he didn't hear her. And the second time she came, she said, "Sir, fasten your seatbelt." Ali got indignant over that. He said, "Fasten my seatbelt? Do you know who I am? I'm Muhammad Ali. I'm the heavyweight champion of the world, and I don't need no seatbelt." And then immediately she shot back, "Oh, you're the heavyweight champion of the world, and you're Superman, you said, and you don't need no seatbelt? Well, Superman don't need no airplane either." So we have got to rely on organizations like ABC to get our information so we do not have to become a Superman or Superwoman. And it's good to be here to talk to you about my book, Quiet Counsel. As Paul mentioned, I'm on the board of the George W. Bush Presidential Center in Dallas. And I remember at the last board meeting, the CEO of the center, who is retiring, Ken Hirsch, he said, "You know, what we have wanted the Bush Center to stand for, and this is what I think President Bush stands for, is that the center should be a place for civility, moderation, and sound policy." And that's what I hope, after you've read my book, that I've tried to do in my book. This is my first book, and the book is really a tribute to the power of law in our country and the power of the law to achieve good in our country. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, if you look at the arc of recent history, I firmly believe that the law has made our country more just, more prosperous, and more inclusive. So I really, it took me 2.5 years to write this book, but it's something I'm really glad that I was able to complete. The other thing about the book, I think, in fairness, it's also a tribute to our great country. As Paul said, I worked for PepsiCo for 10 years. PepsiCo does business in over 200 countries and territories around the world. I was the General Counsel, the Chief Legal Officer. I don't know how many of these countries I attended and went to, but I went to a number of them. And as I was finishing the book, I thought, you know, this is a great country, and not one time when I was on a trip overseas and we were landing at either the PepsiCo airport in White Plains, New York, or at Kennedy if I was flying commercial, there was not one time during those 10 years after coming back from a business trip did I say, "Oh, that's one country I think that's better than the United States." I never said that. This is a great country. I've traveled a great deal. Let me just mention a couple of things before we get into the book about the publishing process. It's, as I said, this is my first book, and the publishing process is pretty arduous. You have to be humble. How many of you have written books? I know there are people in this audience that have written books. Well, you know you have to be humble because people will turn you down. I had 3 turn downs. And one of the publishers who I really wanted to take my book, he said, "Larry, you've been practicing law a long time. I'm sure you have some enemies." And I said, "Well, I don't know if I would call them enemies, but there's some people who I don't like and they don't like me." And he said, "Well, here's what you do, because I think you have a pretty good book here. What you need to do in your book is identify the enemies and settle the score in the book." And I haven't done things like that during the course of my career, and I didn't start to do it now. I did, thank goodness, found a publisher. Now, the other thing I just want to mention is, why did you write the book? And I get asked that a lot. So in these book talks, I like to cover the question of why did you write a book. It took me 2.5 years to write the book. And, I thought, as Paul mentioned, I have this career where I've had these three big buckets of responsibility as a lawyer: public service, private practice, chief legal counsel for a public company, a large public company. And I thought I had to share some of this with people who followed me. And I remember, since we were in close to Jamestown, New York, one of my favorite AGs, Attorney Generals, Robert Jackson, Robert Jackson said, and it's something that always has stuck with me, Robert Jackson said, it's not the duty of the government to keep the citizens from falling in error. It's the duty of we citizens to keep the government from falling in error. And I thought, well, maybe I can be of help. But last year, we have a friend from Georgia, and I don't know if they're in the audience, but because they're back this week. But we had a friend from Georgia, and she brought a friend with her who is an Episcopalian priest. And we were on our porch, and we were talking about, why did you write this book? And I went through all this stuff about my three big buckets and how I really wanted to help the world. And she says, no, that's not really why you wrote this book. I've been listening to you. You wrote this book because it's a form of closure. And when you think about it, for me personally, it has been a form of closure for me to write the book. And the book covers a number of things. It obviously covers my time in public service as Deputy Attorney General, but it also covers my time at PepsiCo as the General Counsel of a major public company. I deal with corporate governance in the book. I deal with corporate culture because after I retired from Pepsi, my time was not over with. I was appointed by the U.S. Department of Justice to be the corporate compliance monitor for Volkswagen, another little small company. And so I talk about corporate culture, and I write about corporate culture in the book, corporate governance. I talk about diversity, which is a subject of some controversy in today's political world. And I talk about violent crime, and I talk about life, something we all have common ground and experience in. So I won't be able to get through all those things today, but I was thinking about the fact that I'm going to be talking to my friends and neighbors, and I was going to start my talk on my time at PepsiCo, and hopefully I'll be able to get to that, Paul, before we close, or else someone can ask me a question if I don't get to it. But Paul has heard one of my book talks in Sarasota, and he said, you need to talk about your time as Deputy Attorney General. So he asked me to start at that point, like I did in Sarasota, and I'm going to do that. It's a little bit tough when you're about that period of my career in life, when you're talking to your friends and neighbors, but let's talk about it. I was asked by President Bush to be the Deputy Attorney General. He called my home on New Year's Day. He had won the election, but he hadn't been sworn in. And the operator said, Governor Bush wants to talk to Mr. Thompson. My wife, I believe, answered the phone. Governor Bush? And she thought it was a hoax. And he said, Larry, I want you to be a part of my team. I know you need to talk to your wife, but give me a call back tomorrow. And this was a pretty interesting call because at the time I was 55 years old, not a baby. And at the time my practice was really doing well. And I was beginning to think about a retirement. I hadn't really started that aspect, but I was beginning to think about it. And going to serve my country was obviously a great honor, but it was a substantial pay cut for me. But I talked to Brenda, my wife, and talked to our sons, and we both all concluded, without really much thinking, that when the President-elect of the United States calls you and asks you to be a part of the team, you can't turn him down. So I accepted. I was confirmed after going through a lot of stuff I was confirmed in May of 2001 to be the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, and I worked under my still good friend, John Ashcroft. I'm sure all of you remember John, who was the Attorney General of the United States. So here's this, at the time, a prominent lawyer from Atlanta, Georgia. My practice was white-collar criminal defense. I'd been a young prosecutor at one point in my life, and then I went to become a white-collar criminal defense lawyer. I represented all the top individuals, wealthy individuals in Atlanta, a lot of the top corporations in Atlanta. Everything was going good, but I wasn't prepared for what I experienced the first time I went to a National Security Council meeting. I wasn't prepared. And I went to that meeting, and for the first time in my life, I was introduced to terms like Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, people who were trying to kill us. And each meeting got successively more serious. And in each meeting, we were told about incidents in which the terrorists were trying to kill Americans, were trying to kill Americans overseas. There was nothing was presented that there was something at the homeland, but we certainly knew that Americans around the world, or American friends around the world, were not safe. And that was sobering, because this was something new that I'd never experienced in my career. Very sobering. At the same time, as the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, the Department of Justice has a really interesting reporting structure, because everything, almost everything, not quite, but almost everything in the department, the U.S. attorneys, 94 U.S. attorneys' offices, the FBI, the DEA, the Bureau of Prisons, everything reports up to the Deputy Attorney General, me, and then I report to John Ashcroft. So it was a really interesting reporting structure. And I had two terrific people on my staff. Mike Chertoff, who went on to become the Secretary of Homeland Security, and a fellow by the name of David Chris, who went on to become a terrific entrepreneur, but who was a national security expert and was the first Assistant Attorney General in charge of the National Security Division of the Department of Justice. They were working for me and with me, and they said to me at some point, I would say this was in July, Larry, we've got a problem. The FBI agents who are responsible for intelligence, national security, they're not talking to the FBI agents who are responsible for regular law enforcement, and they're not talking to the lawyers in the criminal division. They're not talking to each other. And you might want to ask yourself, well, why aren't they talking to each other? Well, there was an important reason for not talking to each other. It was a constitutional, civil liberties reason, but there was a wall that had developed because of the misuse in the past of the FBI of intelligence information on citizens of the United States. The FBI had misused its intelligence powers and spied on citizens without getting a warrant from a judge, as they should be, and as the Constitution requires. So, for example, Dr. Martin Luther King was, his papers are in the news recently. Dr. Martin Luther King had wiretaps against him. No judge had signed off against them, and the reason for the wiretaps, the FBI said, was because he was an agent of a foreign power. Terrible. Terrible. So there was a legitimate civil liberties reason for the wall, but it had gotten too extreme. And I talked to John Ashcroft about what we would propose to do, and I want to use another, as I said, there were legitimate reasons, but I want to use another quote from Robert Jackson that he wrote in a decision in the 40s, I think it was. Our Constitution is important, but our Constitution is not a suicide pact. So we had to be reasonable about how we were going to protect American citizens from misuse of FBI intelligence, but also we had to be realistic that we were under threat. So I wrote a memo to the FBI and a number of other agencies under DEA, under the Department of Justice. I couldn't write this memo to the CIA because I had no authority over them, but I wrote a memo to them in August, mid-August of 2001. The timing is important. And I said, we need to talk to each other. And so if you have evidence on the intelligence side, if you have evidence that there's going to be a violation of U.S. laws, you need to share them with the agents on the enforcement side, and you need to share them with the attorneys in the Department of Justice. There was an uproar about this. A lot of people in the civil liberties community castigated me for this. I got a call from the head of the FISA court and was concerned about this, and they should have been concerned. This was a departure from what the country had been doing. And so the memo was issued. I took my lumps with the support of John Ashcroft, and then what happened? September 11. So in my mind, the memo did not do any good. And also in my mind, I was being too tepid, not aggressive enough, too scared. And I know intellectually that my memo, even if it had been written the day I was sworn in, probably wouldn't have stopped or prevented what had happened on 9/11. But that made no sense to me as an individual, because I raised my right hand to protect the citizens of the United States, and I didn't do it, in my mind. So I thought, and I'm sure many of you have been in this situation, where you have undertaken tasks where the result of the task, you concluded you were a failure. I'm sure it's a human reaction. And I felt like I had been a colossal failure. 3,000 Americans perished. This was the worst thing that had happened to our country. And thank goodness nothing like that has happened since. But it was difficult. It was a very difficult period of my life. It's been very cathartic for me to talk about it now that in these book talks, because before I had written the book and before the book was published, I'd never mentioned this to anybody. And what happened was I had a very good internist in Washington, D.C. We talked a lot. He knew that I was sick. He knew that I was suffering. And he recommended a person for me to go see, a wonderful psychotherapist. And I went to see her, and we worked through these very difficult issues. So, you know, Paul, I wasn't going to start it there, but I do think in these, I've done several of these book talks, but a number of people have come up to me after the talk, and they've said, you know, thank you, because I have a spouse that has suffered this, or I have suffered this, or I have a child that suffered. And it's mental health, and we all have physical health problems, and it's not an unreasonable thing that any of us are subject to mental health issues, and we shouldn't be embarrassed about them. So that's something I wanted to share with you about my experience as the Deputy Attorney General, and we'll get into that in the sense that the other thing during that period of time was what you had to deal with as the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. I have a hypothetical in the book, and it's a ticking time bomb scenario, I call it. And the hypothetical goes something like this. I'm going to abbreviate it, but it basically, you're at church, 11 o'clock Sunday morning, and the United States Marshals brings word to you that there's a bomb underneath FedEx Stadium that's going to go off between 5 and 8 o'clock, right before the then Washington Redskins play a football game. What do? Well, there's some evidence that there are two people who may know something about this bomb. And one is in a CIA prison in Afghanistan. So you obviously can go interview that person, because when you have a ticking time bomb scenario, the most effective technique that law enforcement has at its disposal is just to talk to the person, to interrogate them. Now, the other person is someone who is a foreign national but who has entered the country legally, and he is in Alexandria, Virginia. Why don't you go and just ask the FBI to talk to him? Remember, this is a ticking time bomb scenario. And you get the information from intelligence. And there are a number of lawyers in the room and know that, intelligence information is not considered probable cause to arrest someone and to try to get them, to try to interrogate them. That's not probable cause. Intelligence information comes from all kinds of sources that have not been verified. Even if you had that, you have to give this person a public defender. You have to read the person their Miranda rights. You just don't have enough time. Well, one thing you can do is to authorize the FBI to take that person in Alexandria off the streets, take him to a Holiday Inn, tell them no rough stuff, but to interrogate them. Well, if you do that, you may be subject to false arrest. You've taken someone who has constitutional rights off the street without due process, and at some point you may be subject to false arrest, and you can be sued individually with civil liability under what's called the Bivens Act. So these are tough dilemmas, and these are the kinds of things that men and women in our government face every day. Now, we recently had the opinion involving President Trump and immunity, and I've read that decision at least 3 times, and I don't think it gives any kind of immunity, criminal or civil, to someone below the president. I don't even think it gives immunity to Vice President Vance. I think it's only with the president and doesn't go down. But even if it did give you some kind of criminal protection, you still have civil liability. And so I had to deal with, not that hypothetical, because it's a hypothetical. I had to deal with one where a fellow by the name of Arar, and I talk about this in the book because it's been litigated, and everything that I write about it in the book comes from public records. But this guy, Arar, I can say, was a member of Al-Qaeda. And we got word from a foreign government that he was passing through the United States. He was going to land at Kennedy and then go on to Montreal. He was a dual Canadian-Syrian citizen. John Ashcroft, unfortunately, was out of the country. So guess who had to make the decision on Mr. Arar? What do you do with him? Do you allow him to go to Canada? He's a Canadian citizen. We have relationships with Canada, good solid relationships with Canada. Or do you send him back to Syria, where he is also a citizen? But guess what? What do you think about Syria? What do you think I knew about Syria back then? Syria is a place where people were tortured. There's a law in the United States called the Anti-Torture Statute, which makes it a crime for a government official to knowingly send someone to a country where she or he is tortured. So I'm subject to all kinds of different liabilities. I sent him to Syria. I then leave government. I first spent a year at the University of Georgia Law School, getting myself together. Then I went to PepsiCo. And I thought all this was behind me, okay? Well, there are some people in Congress now who want to investigate me. There are a couple people in Congress who want to put me in jail. And so I asked the Department of Justice, would they represent me in this matter? And they said, oh, yes, Larry, of course, you were acting within the course of your duties as the Deputy Attorney General. We're going to represent you. Well, that's good. Well, guess what? About a week later, I get a call from the receptionist in the building at PepsiCo where my office was. Mr. Thompson, there are two gentlemen from the FBI here, and they want to talk to you. Well, they wanted to interview me. So my mother didn't raise a fool. And I knew that I was the subject of this investigation. And I just politely told them, I'm not prepared to talk to you this afternoon. I'll be happy, give me your card, I'll be happy to schedule an interview with you after I talk to my counsel. Well, when I called the DOJ to ask, when could they get counsel, they said, Larry, your job is to cooperate with the government. We can't have counsel for these FBI interviews. What? I'm not going to ever talk to the FBI if I know that I'm the subject of an investigation without counsel. To make a long story short, I retained the law firm of Baker Botts. Does anybody here in the audience know? Baker Botts, it's not a cheap law firm. They gave me the friend and family rate, but it's not a cheap law firm. And so at the end of the day, I had to pay $27,000 out of my own pocket during the course of this investigation. That is not right. And so I think with respect to the ticking time bomb scenario, we really need to have something, and I know a lot of people might be against this, but we need to have something like a national security court. I don't think it will ever have to meet often. It would be applicable only for intrusive investigative techniques like interrogation, and I think it would be appropriate not only from the standpoint, from a political, ideological philosophy. I guess I would consider myself more libertarian than conservative or liberal, and I don't trust the government. I don't want to give the government a blank check in something as important as someone's safety and liberty to leave. I don't trust the government, but more important, I think we need to give official protection to government officials like me so that you don't have to pay lawyers $27,000 2 years after you leave the government. So I've proposed a national security court. Some people, by the way, it only apply to foreign nationals. It does not apply to citizens. I don't think we should ever do anything to take our constitutional rights away, but it would apply to foreign nationals. So that's been the subject of some things. Am I okay? Yep. Okay. One more thing before I leave the Deputy Attorney General job. President Bush asked me to lead the corporate fraud task force after the Enron debacle. You all remember that. And we established the task force, and there were some people in the president's economic cabinet who didn't like what we were doing. We took a very aggressive approach to what I call crime in the suites, just like crime in the streets. Some people got uncomfortable with that. And so I get a call from Alberto Gonzales, who was the White House counsel, and he said, Larry, the president wants you and Bob Mueller was the director of the FBI, the president wants you and Bob Mueller to come over to the White House and meet in the Roosevelt room. Well, tomorrow morning. So I get with Bob and we said, what are we going to do? And so we really decided that we're not going to tell the president the virtues of the task force approach to investigating crime. We're not going to get into that. We're just going to tell him the kinds of things that we're investigating, like a CFO lying to the company's independent public auditor, like the CEO making up things during a quarterly earnings call that had not been vetted or approved during the prep for the call. So we went over there, and it was really interesting. You got to think about the Roosevelt room, and there's the president, and at least 20 of his economic advisors, at least 20 of them, on one side of the table. On the other side of the table, it's Larry Thompson and Bob Mueller. That was imposing. So we proceed to give President Bush 2 or 3 examples of the things that we were investigating, outright lies by corporate officials to their auditors or to the investing public, just outright lies. And all of a sudden, I see President Bush's face tightening up. And then he looks at one of his advisors, and I didn't put this in the book. I'm not going to put that guy's name in the book. But he looked at one of his advisors, and he said, "We can't let people get away with this, can we?" And then I felt really good about that. And then he called me LT sometimes, and he called Bobby, and then he said, "LT, Bobby, good work, keep it up." And I'll never forget that. And it does bring back something I think all of us in this room now are facing. It does bring back the efficacy in terms of economic crimes, white-collar crimes. I think it's a moral hazard, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, for our country not to be serious about white-collar crime. I think it undermines our capitalist economic system. I think it's something that we cannot take for granted. And we really need to investigate and be serious about these kind of crimes. And I remember, and I talk about this in my book, I remember the fact that I was at the University of Michigan Business School, which is right across the street from the University of Michigan Law School, which I graduated from. But we had a robust debate about some of the tenets of what should you, in terms of white-collar crime, should you have regulation or should you have enforcement? My view, after a number of years and experience in this area, regulation only solves the last scheme. And we humans are very smart. And you can regulate the last scheme, but there's going to be somebody who's going to figure out a way around that regulation. Enforcement, nothing concentrates a business executive's attention rather than the fact of enforcement and the fact that she or he may be going to jail. So I'll talk one more. What if, and this is, I'm an old man and I like to tell stories, but this is an interesting story. You remember Sandra Day O'Connor, and she decided to retire, and President Bush nominated his friend, and a very good lawyer, by the way, Harriet Miers, to the Supreme Court. And Harriet, well, let me just say, Harriet is a very good lawyer, but there were a number of people who didn't think she was sufficiently ideological enough to be on the court. And there was a lot of criticism, and the president withdrew her name. And so at some point, Josh Bolten, who was the chief of staff of the White House, called me and said, "The president knows you, he trusts you. Would you be willing to come over to the White House if he calls you over? Because they don't want you to turn the president down. So if you accept an invitation to the White House, you really need to accept the invitation as to whatever the president's going to ask you to do." So I went home and I talked to Brenda. And I said, well, this is, we're just getting into our work at PepsiCo. I knew what a Supreme Court justice made, and this was going to be a lot less. And so I wouldn't be here at Chautauqua, but I said, what should we do? And she said, well, you can't turn this down. And I tell Josh that I'm willing to accept the call. Well, guess what? The call never came. The call never came. Thank you, I agree. I didn't know what happened until years later. There was a book that was written by Jan Crawford Greenberg about the Supreme Court. And in the book, she has a couple pages about me. And what happened was that Alex Azor, who was the head of Health and Human Services, during the first Bush administration, heard that I might get the nod from President Bush, who liked me, and I liked him. And he convened a meeting of some members of the Federalist Society at the Capitol Grill in Washington, D.C., and I had some good bona fides. I had been the lawyer, one of the lawyers representing Justice Thomas during his confirmation hearing. So I had some good bona fides, and people said, you know, Larry's a nice guy, but we don't know if he is philosophically centered for this position. We think he might tilt left, like Anthony Kennedy. I translate that to mean he might become impartial. Heaven's sake, we appoint an impartial judge. I mean, we can't do anything like that. So in any event, I never got the call, and the person who did get the call, fine person, smart guy, Samuel Alito. What if? Paul, I'm willing to take some questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Larry Thompson, please. While we have some people assembling to ask questions, let me ask you, you could probably spend an hour on this. What do you think of the current lawfare that's going on, where the judges around the country are impacting upon the president and his rights?
Well, we've had some important norms in the Department of Justice, which I love. And I know some of the people in the current administration, and I'm going to be the last person to criticize them. They're good men and women who are entering public service. And to answer your question directly, in the preceding administration, and I think to the best of my knowledge, political decisions did not impact prosecutive decisions, did not impact investigations, because just the fact that you start an investigation can be ruinous. I don't think lawfare writ large is something that we should be doing. The question is, what's the motivation behind a government investigation? Was it started for political reasons? Now, the investigations directed at President Trump were by the Special Counsel statute, which is another animal, and which needs to be looked at. So I'd like.
Good. I'll hold it.
LT.
Yes, sir.
You triggered a remembrance that I had long forgotten, but I had the same experience of the FBI coming to my small manufacturing plant that we did in the process of making the things we did. We had nickel plating with cyanide, we had copper plating, and we had chrome plating, and we had photo services with silver recovery. And 2 days earlier, it was in the 70s, I was in my 30s, and 2 days earlier, a truck hit a trestle that was too low, or the truck was too high, and it was discovered that they had hazardous waste,
Yes.
contraband hazardous waste. And 2 days later, the FBI came to my company. They came in cold, and they asked to see me and have a plant tour. And I asked back, is this related to that? And they said no.
Oh.
I called my attorney, and I said to him, I explained what I just explained to you. He says, you do not have to receive them. If they don't present a warrant or something, they cannot, they can't walk in on you cold and ask for those kinds of things without having a cause and to give you notice.
And your answer is, I agree with everything you said.
I agree, and you have a very good attorney. May I just respond too? So I've had one argument before the United States Supreme Court when I was the Deputy Attorney General, and the whole question was about a consensual police-citizen encounter. And if the police meet you on the sidewalk and they just say, "I want to see your purse," what do you do? Do you say, "No, sir, I'm not going to open my purse. If you get a warrant, I will open it"? Or do you just open the purse? And so I was practicing that night before we went before the Supreme Court. And my wife, who's married to a lawyer, I posed this hypothetical to her about, well, what about if the police wants to see your purse, you just meet them on the sidewalk? She says, "Well, of course, I have to let them see my purse." We citizens don't understand our rights. And you don't have to let them see your purse. You could politely say, "Go fly a kite."
Yes, sir.
Hello, sir. Thank you for coming to Chautauqua. I have two questions, short questions. My first question is, what kind of advice or counsel would you give the current Attorney General, Pam Bondi, during your time? Like, is there like any sort of like every other administration? Is there like some sort of meeting between the former attorney generals and deputies, maybe to just, I don't know, give counsel on the future? Second question would be, what kind of advice would you give young Americans like myself, specifically Republican, on how to basically ensure in the future that we uphold our Constitution and legal processes? Thank you.
Well, let me take the second one. I think, a lot of us think that politics is a dirty word. And I was named United States Attorney, and I see some friends of mine from Atlanta who remember this. I was 37 when President Reagan asked me to be the United States Attorney in Atlanta. Was I the most qualified lawyer in Atlanta at 37 years old to be the United States Attorney? No, but I had been involved in the political process. I'd made certain I was a bona fide, legitimate lawyer. I worked very hard. So I would say, young man, there's nothing dirty about being in politics. Stay involved in politics. We need good, smart people in politics. You may never want to work for the government, but I think being involved in the civic life of our great country is important. We need good people on the Republican side, and we need good people on the Democratic side. So on the advice, I was Deputy Attorney General, so I'm not going to speak to Attorney General Bondi situation, but I have met the Deputy Attorney General in the current administration, Todd Blanche. I find him to be a good man. I find him to be a superb lawyer. He had been an assistant United States attorney in the Southern District of Georgia. And, I don't know if I need to give him any advice to do his job, but, these jobs are very short term. And all of us have a bad habit, is that we like to eat and we want shelter over our heads. So we need to be able to, after we get out of government, to take care of ourselves. And I would just always tell people in the government, remember, especially the political appointees, there's a future after the government. And what's so sad is some people get so caught up in the spirit of one administration or the other. It pains me to see how when they've left government, they really can't get the kind of jobs they should get. And so that would be my counsel.
First of all, thank you for your service to the country. And secondly, George Bush was wrong not to have you join the Supreme Court of the United States.
Thank you.
My question is about the last 6 months. We have seen all kinds of executive orders being contested in the courts. People seem to take these to friendly courts. I'm thinking of the immigration issues and some of these others. Is the Constitution working in this situation, or do we have a problem?
Well, to date, I think, I'm an optimist. But speaking of an optimist and a pessimist, one of my Jewish friends, when I said I'm an optimist, one of my Jewish friends said, all the optimists ended up in the concentration camps. The pessimists lived. So I hope I'm not. But I think this is a resilient country. whether you agree with the executive orders or not, I think the judiciary has held firm on and applied the executive orders in terms of the way I read the law and the Constitution. I think we will get past this. I'm not one of these hair on fire, and I don't have much hair, but I'm not one of these hair on fire individuals that think that everything is going down. But I'm reasonably optimistic that it's a resilient country, and we're going to remain, and this is the important thing, ladies, it's not whether you're Trump or anti-Trump, that we're going to remain a country of the rule of law. That's what's important for me. If any of you, no matter what your political orientation is, if you think that we are not following the rule of law, then heaven help us as a country.
Before our last question, I'd like to remind everybody that we have some books by Dr. McCullough that are free for your taking. We are asking a donation if you choose to do that. And we have a lot of clear bags out there, too, that you may take. No donation necessary. Please.
The bags are not for cookies.
We had somebody come in with a...
And Paul, my books are not free yet.
As long as you don't have them in your garage for a long time, you don't have 1,000 of them, right? Okay.
You mentioned earlier in regard to Martin Luther King that you received a call from somebody, presumably one of the attorneys on the FISA court, okay? And presumably that person has some questions regarding what was going on.
It was the chief judge of the FISA court.
Can you compare that to what happened more recently when the FISA court apparently was hoodwinked multiple times in regard to what they were being asked to do, and they apparently agreed to do it despite what they shouldn't have done?
Well, the FISA court, as you know, the FISA court is, it's one-sided. And any lawyer that would, if I was Deputy Attorney General, if I was still in, any lawyer that misrepresented something to the FISA court and proven to knowingly misrepresent not an innocent mistake, but a knowing misrepresentation of the FISA court, I would make certain that professional discipline would be undertaken against those lawyers.
Before we let Larry go, if you have his book, he would be more than happy to sign it for you after the event here. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause. Larry Thompson.